Sir, well, good morning and good afternoon to you, sir, and also to those of you who are connecting from Europe. And hopefully, you're having a nicer weather than we have, as we have had our first snow of the season a couple of days ago in Ohio. My name is Cihan AYDINER. I am the secretary for NATO Veterans Initiative. I'm also an assistant professor at Bullard College of Business at John Carroll University. So as part of our NATO Veteran Speaker Series, we're delighted to have retired General Gordon Skip Davis with us today to enlighten us about the latest NATO summit, the constantly changing security environment, and some assessments about the future. I'm joined with my colleague, Dr. Cihan AYDINER, who is a assistant professor of Homeland Security at the Aeronautical University and director of our NAVI Research Institute. So a couple of words about the flow of the session. And we will first hear General Davis' presentation, which is about 1.5 minutes, and about the overview, again, key takeaways from the Vilnius Summit and the way forward. Then we'll have the Q&A session. Until then, or in the meantime, please have your questions put in the chat box and to myself or to Dr. AYDINER, and we'll try to ask those questions on behalf of you. Just up front, we may not get to all of them due to the time constraints, but we'll try to our best to get to as many as possible. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce retired General Gordon Skip Davis. He's currently a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, a member of the Alphen Group, and a senior research fellow for the Simon Center for Ethical Leadership and Interagency Cooperation. He recently served as NATO's Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment. Prior to NATO, Davis served 37 years in the U.S. Army. His last military positions were as Director of Operations, U.S. European Command, Commander of Combined Security Transition Command, Afghanistan, and Director of Operations and Intelligence for Allied Command Operations at Shape, Belgium. A 1981 graduate with a Bachelor of Science in Nuclear Physics from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He also earned Master's of Arts in International Business and Defense Studies from the University of Paul Valéry in Montpellier, France, and Master of Science in Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College. General Davis' professional life has been characterized by operational and institutional military assignments, interspersed with study and practice of international affairs and defense issues, primarily in Europe. He speaks French, Italian, and has lived over 21 years in Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, and UK. He spent over 5 years in U.S., NATO, and United Nations operations throughout Africa, as well as in Iraq and Afghanistan. While attending grad school in France as an Olmsted Scholar, General Davis worked as an intern at the Assembly of Western European Union in Paris, later renamed as the European Security and Defense Assembly. This experience was the beginning of a long-term relation with the NATO and European defense issues. He brings practical experience and conceptual understanding of contemporary and emerging defense issues, as well as executive level experience in operations, intelligence, leader development, capability development, and policy development. So with that, I'll turn it over to you and get your presentation ready on the screen.
All right, thank you very much, Cihan, for the invitation. And I'm sorry that all the listeners had to suffer through that long biography. I'll have to send you a much shorter one next time. But thanks for the invitation, and good morning or good afternoon to all the ladies and gentlemen that are listening today. And I hope that others will have a chance to listen to the recorded version at a later date. What I want to talk to you today, much as Cihan has laid out, is where NATO is right now in addressing current threats and challenges, by starting with a review of decisions that were taken at Vilnius, this year's summit, and the path forward to next year's summit in Washington, D.C., which will also be a celebration of NATO's 75th anniversary. So if you go to the next slide, Cihan. Let me just talk about a bit about the top lines from the Vilnius summit. The big question from the media immediately following the summit was whether or not it had been a success, given the ongoing war, Russian war on Ukraine, and the lack of a definitive invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance. Looking back now, I would certainly say the summit, was a clear success. And I'll give you a number of reasons of why I think so. First, NATO was united in its commitment of long-term support to Ukraine and future membership in NATO. Second, it remained united in its condemnation of Russia, 3, it made significant progress in implementing or continuing decisions made in Madrid to strengthen the alliance deterrence and defense and adapt the alliance for future threats and challenges. And 4th, the G7 countries managed to coordinate and announce their intent during the summit to provide significant security guarantees to Ukraine, to develop sustainable armed forces in order to deter Russia post-conflict and defeat future Russian aggression. And many G7 members have begun discussions with Ukraine on the details of security guarantees, to include most recently Italy and the European Union this week. At the time, headlines were dominated by Ukraine President Zelensky's disappointment at the lack of a concrete timeline for Ukraine membership, which is true, but given the concern of several NATO allies to engage directly in a conflict with Russia and the consequences that might have for escalation and expansion of the war, and then, of course, the nuclear powers, U.S., France, and UK, as well as Germany, were not going to invite Ukraine until there was an agreed concept on how they could do so and still avoid a direct conflict with Russia. What Ukraine did achieve, however, was significant and no way diminishes its hopes for future membership. On the contrary, decisions by allies will ensure it continues to receive the support it needs to prevail over Russia, seek justice from Russia's brutal aggression, and prepare for future membership in NATO. Decisions included the removal of the usual requirement for a membership action plan, a multi-year program of assistance in the form of the NATO Comprehensive Assistance Package to improve interoperability and help transform Ukraine's defense sector, strong political support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, its right to choose the international organization it wants to join, and to support Ukraine for as long as it takes for it to prevail. A unanimous statement to condemn Russia for its brutality, targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, its war crimes, and to hold Russia accountable. And finally, the establishment of the NATO-Ukraine Council as a mechanism for Ukraine to consult as an equal with NATO allies. In terms of follow-up from Madrid from the previous year and the implementation of the 2022 strategic concept, allies unveiled several actions and policy decisions to strengthen deterrence and defense, to welcome Finland and agree Sweden as new members, to advance other policies and efforts addressing threats and challenges to NATO like China, climate change, and others, to increase defense investment, defense production, and to continue to pursue innovation and adoption of advanced technologies. And finally, to increase resilience of civilian infrastructure by establishing national targets and a greater focus on assessment, as well as collective effort on protecting critical undersea infrastructure, including the establishment of a Maritime Center of Excellence and a Maritime Coordination Cell, both focused on maritime critical undersea infrastructure. So the bottom line was NATO remained united. It will soon include Sweden, given what's happened since. Ukraine has moved closer to NATO and membership, and Putin has a lot to be concerned about. Let's move to the next slide. Let me talk a few other details by taking a deeper look at under the top lines, so we can kind of appreciate the breadth of decisions and actions taken at and in the margins of the summit. First, with respect to support for Ukraine, 11 nations agreed to a joint F-16 training plan, primarily led by the contributions from Denmark and the Netherlands. That has started in Romania now. France, Germany, and the U.S. all announced additional weapons assistance packages, including for long-range strike missiles, France, Patriots and Leopard tanks, think Germany, obviously, and the U.S. there, HIMARS, air defense systems, artillery munitions, and of course, much discussed, but also very effective, the dual-purposed improved conventional munitions from the U.S. Second, in terms of strengthening deterrence and defense, much progress. The first set of actionable plans since the Cold War were announced. Regional plans were approved. They were the final set of the family of plans that have been completed over the past 2 years. Allies successfully generated the forces to meet the needs of those plans, that family of plans, through a new NATO force model of 300,000 troops at higher readiness. For reference, that's tenfold of what was previously committed into the NATO response force. Then also integrated air and missile defense was strengthened in the form of a rotational package of air and missile defense forces, starting with 4 deployments in NATO's eastern boundaries with Russia and Belarus in the northeast, and of course Black Sea in the southeast. A digital transformation implementation strategy was approved, and I can go into that, but that's extremely important for interoperability. And also cyber and space initiatives were approved. Thirdly, in terms of other threats and challenges, allies announced a future climate security center of excellence. That's been established now in Montreal, Canada. A continued commitment in countering adverse aspects of Chinese activities and influence impacting NATO's interests and values, and the launch of a review of threats and challenges emanating from the South. And I'll come back to that later in recent ministerial decisions. Finally, in terms of defense investment and innovation, allies approved a more ambitious defense investment pledge to invest at least 2% of annual GDP on defense, making that a floor, not a level of ambition. They announced a defense production action plan to aggregate demand, assess and boost industrial capacity, and then increase interoperability and material standardization. And progress was made in accelerating innovation in defense capability development. Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, or DIANA, issued its first 3 challenge areas, and now they've already received proposals for those challenge areas, and they'll continue forward the development of prototypes in the coming months. Next slide, please. So the first ministerial meetings following the summit occurred 11-12 October, and the second just this week, 28-29 November, the last couple of days. Defense ministers met in October, and of course the foreign ministers just met in Brussels this week. Both meetings were meaty, partly due to ongoing events and partly due to the need to take forward policy decisions and actions in preparation of the 2024 summit. Ministerial meetings normally occur between 4 to 6 times a year, but actually since 2022, they've been much more frequently, including informal meetings in person or via video conference to coordinate collective decisions and actions. Let me first cover the October Defense Minister meeting. Ministers addressed several threats and challenges to NATO, most related to current events. They discussed the conflict in Israel, which was just 5 days after the Hamas attacks, and it included the Israeli Defense Minister, Gallant. And afterwards, they collectively condemned the Hamas terrorist attacks, supported Israel's right to defend itself, but also, interesting early on, highlighted the importance of protection of civilians as essential. And that was when, casualties were well under 1,000 in terms of Palestinians killed or injured. Ministers also discussed unrest in Kosovo, and there had been about 4 months of unrest and violence if you were tracking the Western Balkans from May to September. The EU's High Rep, Josep Borrell, joined the discussion, and NATO announced the deployment of several battalions from Romania, Bulgaria, and the UK to ensure KFOR had the forces needed to fulfill its UN mandate impartially. Defense ministers also addressed damage to an undersea gas pipeline and telecommunications cable connecting Finland and Estonia on 11 October. And allies expressed solidarity with Estonia and Finland as they worked through the investigation. Of course, just a couple of weeks later, Finnish investigators said they believed it was a 6-ton anchor of a Chinese container ship that was dislodged and caused the damage. Doesn't appear to have been done deliberately, but nonetheless, it significantly raised awareness of the need to protect critical undersea infrastructure. NATO leaders agreed, as I said, to establish the NATO Maritime Center for the Security of Critical Undersea Infrastructure, and to do so at the UK's NATO Maritime Command in Northwood. The aim of that center is to increase situational awareness and enhance deterrence and defense of the maritime domain. And earlier this year, NATO created a critical undersea infrastructure coordination cell at NATO headquarters in Brussels to improve information sharing and exchange best practices between allies, partners, and the private sector. On threats from terrorism, the SecGen announced that the Assistant Secretary General for Operations, Tom Goffis, would be his special coordinator for counterterrorism. And on Iraq, allies agreed to evolve NATO's mission to provide more support to Iraqi security forces. With respect to strengthening deterrence and defense, some significant steps were made. First, in terms of assigning forces to the new regional defense plan across the whole of SACEUR's area of responsibility, using that NATO force model I discussed earlier. And second, how the new plans will be exercised. Third, what adjustments will be needed to Allied command and control, which are significant. And fourth, in light of Russia's war in Ukraine and threats in general, what capabilities or new capabilities will be needed for the alliance? And they go they extend over quite a few areas. I could list them: C4ISR, integrated air missile defense, anti-submarine warfare, naval mine warfare, maritime engagement, autonomous systems, indirect fire, long-range strike, munitions, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop there, but we can go into that in more detail if you'd like. They talked about progress in investing more in defense, as 11 allies had now reached the 2% goal or floor now in 2023, and more were expected within the coming year. And finally, ministers held, or at least likely held because it wasn't announced, a meeting of the nuclear planning group with Finland attending for the first time. After the ministerial, NATO SecGen announced the annual nuclear exercise, Steadfast Noon, and it was only the second time in recent history that allies have publicly discussed this exercise. It's held annually, but it's usually kept on low profile. With respect to the path for Sweden, ministers met with invitee Sweden for much of the ministerial meetings. Turkey announced its support and the next steps that Erdogan would be forwarding ratification to the Turkish Grand National Assembly. That actually occurred on 23 October. So now we're waiting for word from approval of the Grand National Assembly. Hungary will also have to ratify Sweden's membership, but it's expected to do so rapidly following Turkey. With respect to Ukraine, NATO held its first NATO-Ukraine Council at ministerial level. It included Ukraine's Defense Minister Umerov, who updated allies on the situation on the battlefield, Ukraine's most urgent needs, and more. And NATO announced it would provide more non-lethal assistance, primarily cold weather, clothing, demining capabilities, fuel, medical support, etc. And then allies discussed Ukraine's priorities on its path to NATO membership, including long-term interoperability with NATO and defense procurement reform. And I would assume that this was in the context of the NATO Comprehensive Assistance Package that was announced back in July. In conjunction with the defense ministers meeting, 50 NATO allies and partners, which includes also EU, by the way, met at NATO headquarters in the format of the US-led Ukraine Defense Contact Group to discuss military or specific military assistance needs. And for the first time, President Zelensky attended in person and emphasized the importance to step up and sustain military aid to Kiev as it braced for another wartime winter. And allies afterwards pledged further aid, including F-16 jets and training and air defense systems, ammunition, and more. Finally, multiple defense investment initiatives were signed and announced in between the ministerial sessions. In the maritime domain, NATO ministers and the Swedish defense minister endorsed the Digital Ocean Vision. And I would encourage you to look that up. It's a pioneering initiative to enhance NATO's maritime situational awareness from seabed to space. It began about 6 years ago. Really, really interesting, but I'll stop there and go into more detail if asked. NATO allies also announced their intent to develop a roadmap to guide the further development of maritime capabilities in line with other efforts of the alliance, including NATO's Digital Transformation and Defense Production Action. In the air domain, allies agreed to two initiatives, or at least a group of allies. The Germany and UK joined the NATO Flight Training Europe High Visibility Project, which brings total number of participants to 12. And this is a project meant to bring together a number of assets as well as capabilities across the 12 members to fundamentally reshape how aircrew training is done, reduce the fragmentation, increase the interoperability and standards, lower training costs, and provide basically more slots to both crewed and uncrewed systems. Also, 13 allies and invitee Sweden signed an agreement to cooperate on cross-border airspace. And this is significant because that's needed for training at scale in the air domain. And finally, in terms of multi-domain, defense ministers from 10 countries signed an agreement that will build the legal framework for future air defense purchases under the European Sky Shield initiative that was launched by Germany last year. And that initiative aims to bolster European air and missile defense through the joint acquisition of interoperable off-the-shelf air defense equipment and missiles by European nations. Let's go to the next slide and talk about this week's foreign minister meeting. Okay. The foreign minister meeting discussed violence in the Middle East and instability in the Western Balkans. And on the former public statements from NATO SecGen, this time really focused on welcoming the pause in hostilities, the release of hostages, and the passage of humanitarian relief. Ministers also discussed challenges emanating from the southern neighborhood. If you recall, there was an agreement to review challenges to the south, and the SecGen updated ministers on the independent group of experts he's appointed to submit recommendations by next spring on what more NATO can do to prevent crises, fight terrorism, and enhance stability. Ministers also discussed global NATO partnerships, in particular cooperation and info exchange with Indo-Pacific partners on China. And in this context, they reiterated China is not a NATO adversary, but that NATO continues to watch and discuss the impact of China's coercive policies on NATO security and to encourage dialogue with China on issues of mutual concern. Ministers welcome progress of Sweden's NATO membership and, of course, looking forward to the ratification by Turkey's parliament. On strength and deterrence and defense, foreign ministers approved NATO's first quantum technology strategy, which aims at seizing the opportunities presented by quantum technologies, communications, sensing, and computers, while preventing competitors from using these technologies against NATO. They agreed to upgrade the NATO AWACS fleet with the next generation command and control aircraft by buying 6 new Boeing E-7 Alpha Wedgetail aircraft, which will be ready by 2031. And then they discussed prospective agenda and goals for the DC summit. These are still early days, and so no details were released publicly. With regard to Ukraine, ministers reiterated their support for Ukraine and held the second ministerial level NATO-Ukraine Council with Foreign Minister Kuleba present in person, and also issued a joint NATO-Ukraine statement. In addition to condemning Russia aggression and violence and war crimes and targeting of civilians, allies reiterated their support for Ukraine on its path to membership and agreed that Ukraine will become a member of NATO, but they stopped short of declaring an invitation would be offered in DC next year. They did, however, agree to transform NATO's comprehensive assistance package into a multi-year program of assistance to help Ukraine transition from Soviet-era equipment to NATO equipment and standards to make their forces fully interoperable with the alliance. It provided recommendations on Ukraine's priority reforms, including fight against corruption, strengthening the rule of law, supporting human rights, minority rights, etc. And they acknowledged that Ukraine had made concrete changes in the fight against corruption, setting up and overhauling the system for defense procurement in close coordination with NATO, and also modernizing their intelligence services. These are part of the briefing details that Foreign Minister Kuleba provided the allies. And with respect to security assistance, individual allies made a number of announcements. Germany and Netherlands pledged billions of euros in military assistance over the next year. Romania talked about its opening of the F-16 training center, and then U.S. and Finland and a few others announced more security packages, including air defense, HIMARS, combat vehicles, ammunition, etc. And finally, 20 allies established what was called an air defense coalition for Ukraine to provide ground-based air defense systems and promote interoperability amongst these systems in support of Ukraine's armed forces and cities and civilian infrastructure. I've also seen discussion of IT and maritime coalitions from Ukrainian sources, but not enough information is available on those details. We'll probably see them in the coming days and weeks. Last slide, and I'm coming down to the end. The to-do list for the Washington, D.C. summit is fairly long. Okay, now this is my prediction, given the types of discussions I've heard so far and what seems to be forecasted by discussions from the recent ministerials, as well as what came out of the Vilnius Summit. First, obviously, the question of continued military and political support to Ukraine and future NATO membership. And NATO has stated collectively, and many allies have stated individually, that they intend to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. A few like France have clarified this, that this means as long as it takes for Ukraine to win. Slovakia's new Prime Minister Fico could make support to Ukraine more difficult, but the real military assistance continues to come from individual allies. NATO itself only provides non-lethal assistance as an organization. So Slovakia and even Hungary are unlikely to derail existing NATO decisions and future support. More importantly is the future of U.S. assistance. The most important factor seems to be the House of Representatives. Support, as we probably know, certainly those Americans will probably know this from polling, that support goes across both parties, especially in the Senate. And it's much more likely than not that Congress will eventually agree to continue military assistance to Ukraine, including through 2024. Second, related to a united NATO front against Russian aggression, I strongly believe NATO, including Slovakia and Hungary, are already committed to continuing current strategy, policies, and defense plans in which Russia remains the alliance's greatest direct threat. Now, Hungary under Orban has continued to approve classified strategies, concepts, plans to deter and defend against Russia, and it's pledged forces at high readiness and joined most of NATO's multinational defense investments to improve its relevant defense capabilities. In fact, it recently deployed a battle group forward to the east. Third, with respect to strengthening deterrence and defense, I think we expect to follow through on many policies decided at Madrid and Vilnius, namely to increase national force readiness in accordance with the new NATO force model, to provide SACEUR with the information he needs to assess force readiness on a real-time basis, to upscale force contributions to NATO exercises, especially those meant to exercise new plans, to decide on changes and increases to NATO command structure, and this is response to whatever SACEUR eventually forwards as a request for or as a result of a C2 assessment, and then to increase contributions to NATO's forward defense posture in the east with forces, rotational capabilities like air missile defense, etc. And they'll also likely complete a digital transformation plan. Fourth, I believe Sweden will be a full member by the DC Summit, and that's going to be a major goal and certainly effort of the SecGen and other allies to see that through. Fifth, the group of independent experts will produce its reflection report in the South, and they will include multiple recommendations on how NATO can better engage in the South. That includes the Middle East, North Africa, Sahel, etc. Better prevent crises, better respond to threats and challenges from the South, etc. And that can include an array of things, such as a strategy for the South, defense concepts, defense policies, tailored structure to support instability in the South or reduce instability in the South, etc. Sixth, defense investment and innovation will be high priority deliverables. We'll see more strategies and more specific capabilities probably announced. 2024, in a related way, will be the year to see how many allies actually met the original defense investment pledge objectives of 2%, 20%, and over 20 allies have plans to meet or exceed the 2% target. All exceed or all meet or exceed the 20% target right now. Allies will agree on the next planning cycle of military capability requirements, which will include the new forces for these plans. And it'll be the first time that these capability requirements will be plans-based since the Cold War. Allies will probably announce progress in the Defense Production Action Plan, probably in terms of understanding industrial capacity, increasing it, and producing land-based munitions. And then Diana will likely announce its awardees of the final phase of its innovation challenges, as well as new 2024 challenge areas. And then finally, I expect progress in increasing resilience. There'll probably be announcement of national resilience targets, additional measures on cybersecurity, measures to respond to threats to critical undersea infrastructure, improvements to road and transport infrastructure, et cetera, all related to supporting NATO defense and reinforcement. Okay, I've gone really fast, and that's exactly 25 minutes. So I hope that you were able to follow that quick blast, but if not, I'm open to your questions, and I can recover old ground or cover new ground as you see fit. So back to you, Saban. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was very informative, and we'll get to the Q&A session right now. I'm looking at the chat if there's any questions over there, but let me start with my first question, and then I guess follow-up questions will ensue with Dr. AYDINER. So would you, some analysts claim that it's a transition from a post-Cold War capacity-based defense planning to a more traditional threat-based approach with the recent summit, and taking into account again what's been going on with Russia and Ukraine and China's ambitions regarding in that region. And if you do agree with that statement, there's a strategic shift. What would be the implications for the member nations in general? So say capacity versus threat-based planning.
Okay, that's a great question, and that's been debated significantly over the last several years. Starting with the NATO military strategy, which was produced by frankly, it was produced by Allied Command Operations, approved by the Military Committee, and then endorsed or acknowledged by different ministerial meetings afterwards, because the Council was afraid to approve something it didn't ask for. And so that started the thinking, because in that military strategy, Russia and then international terrorist groups were identified as the principal threats against NATO. And allies agreed to that. Certainly the chiefs of defense did. Okay. And then second, as the Council became more and more familiar with that, they bought in on it and became much, much more vocal in support of that strategy. In 2020, the deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area concept was announced, and then by, again, SACEUR, approved by the Military Committee, and then formally endorsed by the Council. So, you know, the plan or the concept to implement the strategy was approved even before the strategy was formally approved, so to speak. Again, that was focused on how are we going to deter and defend against these threats and other unforeseen threats and challenges. And then finally, in 2021, the NATO warfighting capstone concept was approved by Military Committee, and by Council, and by leaders in Brussels, when this was meant to figure out what are the kinds of the capabilities and not just force structure, but really the capabilities needed for NATO to respond to threats foreseen over the next 20 years. So all that laid out a huge problem with the existing force structure and plans to address current threats, and the urgency to continue to transform and adapt over the next 20 years to foreseen threats and challenges. And that raised the level of urgency, I think, by allies to the point where when they went through the strategic concept development process, which finished at Madrid in 2022, they had decided on a strategic concept that was much more ambitious than the previous several since the Cold War, where they recognized Russia as the most direct threat, where they also recognized that deterrence by punishment, by cost, imposition, by massive response to aggression was not going to cut it, because that would not save, small countries that could be overwhelmed in the instance of a Russian aggression against, let's say, the Baltic countries, or even, Norway, given its size and population forces. So what they decided to do was create or endorse a concept of deterrence by denial, where you deny the adversary the ability to achieve its objectives. You can only do that if you've got the forces at readiness and postured, ready for the type of threat that Russia poses to the alliance. And we've seen in the Ukraine war what that means. It's a massive ability to strike from multiple domains, at infrastructure, at forces, at command, or capitals. If the recently certainly capitals in terms of civilian infrastructure, and therefore integrated air missile defense is a huge issue. But also the mass of troops that initially invaded Ukraine, and although they weren't prepared logistically, supplied, planning and in mental state to succeed, nonetheless they represented hundreds of thousands of troops, and the NATO has maybe a little over 10,000 troops deployed along its borders. Okay, so 10 to 20 scale below what Russia could mass, for Ukraine. Those were wake-up calls. And so, first off, allies realized that, okay, 2% probably won't cut it to make up for the nadir or the vast gap of defense development over the last 30 years. They're going to have to do more than that, which is why the 2% floor was agreed to in Vilnius this year, as well as last year, not highly publicized, but a significant amount more of common funding was approved for things that glue the alliance together, communications and communications technology, and other things that have to do with exercises and training, etc. So more money there that is needed to develop the interoperability of forces to respond to aggression at scale. And then the plans were in development for quite some time, but were the obvious requirement from the military point of view. If you want us to defend the alliance, we've got to have a plan that's approved where nations buy in and commit to forces that we can count on, which is why the whole family of plans was developed, first from the SECURE's AOY strategic plan approved in late 20, early 21, and then sub-strategic plans, and finally the regional plans, where nations had to basically pony up with forces to meet the force requirements of defense of those regional plans. And that's where the NATO force model was a facilitator, saying we want to have 300,000 troops at readiness. Okay, and now that force generation went on well, and now of all those forces that were basically committed by allies to maintain at high readiness, and that's basically less than 60 days, and most at 30 days or less, the 200,000 plus at 30 days or less, have to be allocated or apportioned to the various regional plans, and that's where the money comes in. Where if allies are going to do that, okay, well then they've got to follow through with the readiness in terms of equipment, training, and forces to meet the requirements that come from the plan, and so that's just now working through, and the military minimum capability requirements, which will be approved early next year through the normal NATO defense planning process, should reflect for the first time those force requirements, and that's huge issue, huge work that the Defense Policy Planning Committee and nations are going through right now, and then the next step will be to apportion those requirements to nations by 2025, and that's where the rubber meets the road, and either nations will have those forces now, or at least they'll commit to the filling the delta for the forces and equipment needed for the plans.
Perfect. Thank you, sir.
That was a long explanation, but just to show you, this is years in development. It's not something that the allies have turned on a dime on.
Perfect. I'll turn over to Dr. AYDINER for the next question.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, General Davis. It was a great informative session. We have great questions on QA, and I want to be very selective and start with this one. How can NATO address internal challenges to democracy, considering the global decline in democratic freedom and rising authoritarianism, as highlighted by Projects 2021, findings that less than a fifth of the world's population lives in fully free countries? What role can civil society play in non-democracies to foster positive change based on examples from Asia, Europe, and Africa?
Great question. And although I'm not a democracy specialist, I'm certainly an observer. And so I will give you some observations and some perceptions, certainly on some things that I've involved in over time with respect to information, public information, and what we could NATO often call strategic communications, et cetera. But I think the trend we have seen, certainly 2016, 2020 with Trump in the U.S., but also a number of other allies have got heads of state and government that are autocratic in style, and that have also imposed certain restraints on either legislation, judiciary branches, or also media, etc. Those are worrisome because all those things reduce the freedoms and liberties that keep democracy alive. I think the most important role that civil society can do is to push back on restraints of freedom from maybe demagogic type of leaders that reduce the likelihood of checks and balances across government, that highlight the issues of potential corruption or loss of civil liberties, and certainly promote education and understanding of disinformation, misinformation, so people can distinguish between what is true and not. Now, I say that, and I come from a country that has a huge issue with misinformation and belief in propaganda and rumors and all sorts of other things. Most of you, I think, probably live in the U.S., and so you understand that. That's a challenge that it's really for all of us who are freedom and democracy lovers to help fight against by playing our role in pushing back on false information, in trying to I would say promote a civilized dialogue amongst different political ideas, and promote what has normally been the work of politics: compromise, and basically consensus building along areas of joint interest. And so I think that this is where I don't think society can continue to remain disengaged. It needs people that are engaged and interested in the future of their children, grandchildren, or themselves if they're young people have got a career ahead of them, to help maintain the principles of democracy, civil liberties, and human rights that have frankly set the conditions for success and prosperity over these last 75 years since World War II. So that's my take.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. I'll vote another one, and you're kind of reaching to an hour limit, and we know that your time is also limited.
I can certainly take another question, so please.
Just one more, and I kind of it gets back to veterans like yourself. We have a lot of experience, knowledge, and background. Where do you see the role of veterans fit in this projection of NATO? How can veterans be a resource to further the idea of NATO? Because there's different spectrum of thoughts on that. So how can we?
That's a great question, because although in general, allied publics support the idea of NATO and what it does, frankly, there's not enough information in the public space about the importance of NATO in securing the alliance's territory, forces, and people, and the positive things that it does and it brings to the alliance. That there's a huge return on investment from the consensus, policy development, capability development, planning, and action that's done by the alliance. And so I think this is the most important thing, is helping inform those who don't come into contact with NATO on a regular basis, and helping multiply and raise the voice of the raison d'être and the positive thing that NATO brings to its allied members. That is not well understood. And I find every time I speak to a U.S. audience, they just don't recognize the scale. The U.S. tends to think, frequently that, NATO is a talk shop. It's not a doing shop. It doesn't really realize a lot. Yep. We haven't had an attack on allies in over 75 years. And so perhaps it's done something, even as it was just standing up before the 1949 treaty. So I think that that's missing sometimes, and it's hard to sell a negative, the lack of aggression. Of course, we've had the one Article 5 declaration of the attack on the U.S. From Al Qaeda and its associates, but that was terrorism, and that's been addressed in multiple ways. And NATO came to the U.S.'s aid in ways that it was needed. So I think all the allies recognize the extreme value of Article 5 commitment, and even though it's up to each ally to determine what that is, it tends to be significant. And even when Article 5 is not declared, allies can still step up and contribute significantly to a security challenges, and that's happened over and over again in both the near abroad, the Balkans, as well as in what we've seen in the East since 2014.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Again, we're kind of reaching to the 1 hour limit. So thanks once again for accepting our invitation. It was a fantastic session, very informative. We look forward to having you in other contemporary security issues in other sessions, and thanks for the attendees as well. And we'll wish you a nice day.
Thanks, Cihan. Appreciate it. And I applaud your initiative. And if you eventually start establishing membership, let me know. Be glad to sign up.
Perfect. Glad to hear that. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Cheers.
Thanks so much.